And the Oscar goes to Peter Jackson.
Lord of the Rings.
Only 5 directors in cinema history have ever crossed the $6 billion mark at the global box office: Steven Spielberg, James Cameron, the Russo brothers, and Michael Bay. But fourth on this legendary list is a bearded visionary from New Zealand named Peter Jackson, a filmmaker who started with almost nothing and went on to build one of the most powerful filmographies in modern cinema, ultimately becoming one of the richest filmmakers in history, with a fortune estimated at over $1 billion.
When I was 8 years old, I made films at home on a Super 8 camera that my mum and dad had bought for me. And they supported me all through the years, and they died in the last few years. They didn't see these films made. So for Bill and Joan, thank you.
In this video, we're breaking down every movie directed by Peter Jackson, looking at the budgets, the box office revenue, and all the production backstories to see how this legend built one of the most successful directing careers the industry has ever seen. Peter Jackson's early career was far from lucrative. His first 3 films were low-budget cult experiments with little to no US distribution. But each one taught him lessons that would eventually lead to his big break. His first film, Bad Taste, was shot over a period of 4 years, with a budget of just $25,000. Jackson used his friends and family as actors, and also created the aliens and gore effects by himself, and even played multiple characters.
And I poured plaster of Paris in to get this effect here. I had to have this expression on my face the whole time. And from this, I was able to make a plaster mold, negative mold. And we ended up with this.
The film never received a wide theatrical release, and reliable box office numbers are nearly impossible to find. It was too niche and too low budget to compete in the mainstream. After Bad Taste, the New Zealand Film Commission agreed to back Jackson's next project, which was called Meet the Feebles, which promised to be riskier and far more ambitious. At first, the film was planned as a television series, but Japanese investors pushed for a feature film.
So we had this other idea called Meet the Feebles, which was a cheaper idea based on puppets like the Muppets, but puppets who do sex and drugs.
The budget was set to $750,000, which was 30 times the amount for his debut. When the movie finally got released, it failed commercially, grossing only $80,000 in New Zealand and barely making it into international markets. The film was too extreme for mainstream viewers, but too unconventional even for typical comedy or puppet audiences. Jackson had to learn that even with institutional backing, an uncompromising vision could still flop. After 2 films that failed to break through, Peter Jackson found himself at a crossroads. But instead of scaling things back, Jackson leaned into the edge of uncertainty. In the summer of '92, Peter Jackson came back with Dead Alive, also known as Brain Dead, a zombie comedy so gloriously unhinged that it held the Guinness World Record for the most amount of fake blood used in a single film.
Oh, Fernando! Your mother ate my dog!
Not all of it.
The plot centers around a timid young man named Lionel, whose life spirals into chaos after his overbearing mother is bitten by a rare and highly infectious creature known as the Sumatran rat monkey. As the bite slowly transforms her into a flesh-eating zombie, the infection spreads throughout the town, unleashing an escalating outbreak of undead carnage. For his third feature film, Jackson was given a much larger budget than his 2 previous films combined, estimated around $3 million. The additional resources were poured into elaborate practical effects, prosthetics, and massive amounts of fake blood, all crafted by Jackson and his team to push the limits of what a low-budget horror film could achieve. The movie's US release was extremely limited, grossing a little over $200,000 in North America. At this stage, Jackson still hadn't secured a major distribution deal to push his films into the mainstream. Today, however, it holds an 89% approval score, as Dead Alive cemented Jackson's reputation as a director who could do more with practical effects and sheer audacity than most could do with a more significant budget. This film also marked the moment Fran Walsh, who would later become Jackson's wife and most trusted collaborator, officially joined the team as a co-writer, and would co-write almost all of his films moving forward. Quietly, Jackson was building a reputation as one of the most inventive filmmakers working outside Hollywood, and that growing reputation was about to lead to one of his most critically acclaimed films. Based on the real-life murder case in 1950s New Zealand, the film follows two teenage girls, Pauline Parker and Juliet Holm, whose intense friendship quickly evolves into an obsessive and dangerously codependent bond. When their families attempt to separate them, the emotional pressure builds until it culminates in a shocking and tragic act of violence. Fran Walsh, Jackson's wife, first told him about the Parker Holm case, and that seed grew into the film.
She'd told me about this very famous murder case that happened in New Zealand, the South Island of New Zealand, Christchurch, in 1954, and it involved these two teenage girls that killed the mother of one of the girls.
To realize the imaginary kingdom of Barovnia, Jackson turned to a prop maker he had met years earlier, Richard Taylor. Together they had recently formed a small effects company called Weta, named after a native New Zealand insect. This company would become extremely important for the future of cinema and would later make Jackson a fortune. The production was a major turning point. With a budget of $5 million, Jackson had more resources than ever, but he used them with restraint. A young Kate Winslet made her film debut as Juliet Holm, delivering a performance that immediately put her on Hollywood's radar. Unfortunately, when Heavenly Creatures hit theaters, it grossed just over $5 million worldwide, yet another financial disappointment. The subject matter was too dark. A true story of adolescent murder was a hard sell for mainstream audiences, but the film's true value was not in its box office numbers, as it immediately became a critical sensation, holding an impressive 95% approval score, with universal praise for its emotional depth, fearless performances, and Jackson's control of tone. It earned Jackson and his wife an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Screenplay, their first Oscar recognition. For the first time in his career, Peter Jackson was no longer just experimenting. He was slowly earning respect. But success still hadn't fully arrived. He was definitely on the edge of something career-defining, but before the glory, there would be one more detour.
Hey, Smaug.
The Frighteners follows Frank Bannister, played by Michael J. Fox, a man who can see and communicate with ghosts after a traumatic accident, but rather than using this ability for good, he decides to scam people by staging fake hauntings, until a real supernatural killer starts targeting the living, forcing him to confront a threat far beyond his control. This was Jackson's first American studio production, backed by Universal. The budget was $30 million, which was more than 3 times what Heavenly Creatures had cost, and by far the largest budget Jackson had ever commanded up to that point. The film was also a proving ground for Weta, tasked with creating the film's supernatural elements. The company was still small, operating out of a converted garage in Wellington, but Jackson trusted them to deliver.
Looking back on my filmmaking career, The Frighteners is a very important movie for me because it is the very first time that I've gone beyond making an independent New Zealand film, which is how my first few movies were financed. They were very, very low budget. And with The Frighteners, I had my first access to what felt like a very big budget at the time. By today's standards, it was quite small, but it was a whole different world for me. I'd never worked with a big movie star before like Michael Fox, had never done anything as complicated with visual effects before. You have to realize that in 1995, when a lot of The Frighteners was being made, CG effects were very new. It was the beginning of that whole trend.
He pushed the team hard, demanding that the ghosts feel tangible, not just digital apparitions, but characters with weight, texture, and personality. The Frighteners grossed around $29 million worldwide, falling short of its $30 million budget, making it another financial disappointment in Jackson's career. Yet The Frighteners was far from a waste. It proved that Weta could handle complex digital work under tight deadlines. More importantly, while the film was still in theaters, a New Line executive named Mark Ordesky was watching it with a different goal in mind. He had been tracking Jackson since Heavenly Creatures and was impressed by the way Jackson balanced tone, character, and visual spectacle. Ordesky became convinced that this was the director who could finally tackle a legendary project that had defeated every other filmmaker who had tried to take it on. And this project would change Jackson's life forever.
Its black gates are guarded by more than just orcs. There is evil there that does not sleep. The great eye is ever watchful. It is a barren wasteland, riddled with fire and ash and dust.
Based on the legendary epic fantasy novel, The Fellowship of the Ring follows Frodo Baggins, a quiet hobbit from the Shire, who inherits a ring forged by the Dark Lord, When Gandalf uncovers its true power, Frodo must leave his home and take on a nearly impossible mission. After years of struggling to turn a profit, Peter Jackson finally had a studio that believed in his impossible vision. New Line Cinema handed him the reins to The Lord of the Rings with a significant budget of $93 million, a massive vote of confidence for a director who had yet to deliver a single commercial hit. But the real bet wasn't just on Jackson, it was on Witter, the tiny effects house he had co-founded in a garage, and on his radical plan to build Middle-earth from the ground up using practical sets, handcrafted armor, and groundbreaking digital technology.
I mean, we'd never done anything like that in New Zealand before. It was our own CG company that was doing it, and it was very much in its infancy at that stage.
Witter Digital developed new software to create the epic battle scenes. Every dollar of the budget was stretched, and every risk was calculated. If the film failed, Jackson would not only cement his reputation as a commercial disappointment, but also lose the company he had built. If it succeeded, he would own the future of fantasy filmmaking forever.
All that we were reading in the press at the time was the fact that it was, an unknown New Zealand filmmaker who had been entrusted with this huge amount of money, that New Line were gambling everything on banking 3 films at the same time. And there was a strong sense in these stories that the films were probably not going to work and the studio would be bankrupt.
Well, fortunately for Jackson, when Lord of the Rings finally hit theaters, it grossed over $870 million worldwide, making it the second highest grossing film of the year and an extremely massive commercial success that nobody really expected, especially from Peter Jackson. But theaters were only the beginning. The film sold over 14 million copies in home videos, generating hundreds of millions more in revenue. Reports state that the studio made over $500 million after exhibitor cuts were taken. The movie currently holds a very impressive 91% critic rating and a 95% audience score, as critics and audiences alike praised the visual effects and the beautiful sets, which highlighted the story and fantasy, and also kept the emotional core intact. It also earned 13 Oscar nominations and won 4, including Best Cinematography, Best Visual Effects, Best Makeup and Hairstyle, and Best Original Score. This proved that fantasy, long dismissed as a niche genre, could carry the same emotional weight and critical prestige as any historical epic. The movie's financial success also transformed New Zealand's film industry, because Jackson had insisted on shooting entirely in his home country, and the success of this film sparked a boom in the country's local production and tourism. Jackson had finally proven he could helm a massive critical and commercial franchise with domestic and international appeal. Now he was more determined than ever to prove that this victory was not a fluke, as the next chapter promised higher stakes, darker challenges, and even bigger battles.
This is Sting. You've seen it before, haven't you? Go. Release him, or I'll cut you throat.
The second chapter in the saga continues, as the once united group is now scattered across a war-torn world. Frodo and Sam continue their journey toward Mordor to destroy the ring, guided by the mysterious and conflicted creature named Gollum, whose dual personality adds both tension and unpredictability to their mission. At the same time, the remaining members of the group are drawn into a growing war, which leads them to a weakened kingdom that stands on the edge of destruction as a massive enemy army prepares to strike. The production, which was already massive, grew even larger. The budget for The Two Towers was $94 million, similar to the first film, but the visual effects required were exponentially more complex. Jackson faced a real-life structural nightmare. The novel's second volume was the most difficult to adapt, with long passages of travel and parallel timelines. Jackson and his co-writers, Philippa Boyens and his wife, Fran Walsh, made the bold choice to move some scenes for the second book to the third film and intercut the 3 storylines to maintain momentum. But the true technical marvel of The Two Towers was Gollum. Witter Digital had created a fully digital character that had to act, speak, and convey emotion alongside live actors. The result was a breakthrough, the first truly believable digital character in cinema history. This movie went on to gross over $947 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing films of its time and a significant increase from the first film. This was more than just another successful sequel, it was the beginning of a billion-dollar franchise and global dominance. Peter Jackson was paid $10 million as a directing fee for each of these films, and more importantly, he negotiated a massive profit participation point estimated at around 7.5% of the worldwide box office gross. For The Two Towers alone, that translated to roughly $71 million, and that was on top of his director's fee. And as the film succeeded, so did Weta. The company had just created a custom rendering technology that would later be used on blockbusters like Avatar and Game of Thrones. The critical reception for The Two Towers was even stronger than its predecessor, holding an impressive 95% critic score, the highest of the entire trilogy. Critics praised the film's darker tone, the deepening character arcs, and the groundbreaking realization of Gollum. Even those who had doubted the first film's length or pacing found themselves won over by the sequel's relentless momentum. The movie also earned 6 Academy Award nominations, winning 2 for Best Sound Editing and Best Visual Effects, a clear signal that the industry was taking fantasy as seriously as any historical epic. The world was now fully invested in Middle-earth, and the pressure was now on Jackson to deliver a satisfying conclusion for the legendary trilogy.
Feast on his flesh.
The Return of the King represents the full realization of everything Peter Jackson had been building towards. As the war for Middle-earth erupts into its final stages, entire cities are placed under siege by overwhelming enemy forces, pushing the last remaining defenders to their limits. Frodo and Sam, guided by Gollum, finally enter Mordor, carrying the ring to the cracks of doom. Although filmed alongside the previous entries, the final installment required extensive additional pickups and refinements to bring the story to its proper conclusion. The budget was set for $94 million, similar to the first 2 films, but the Battle of the Pelennor Fields required tens of thousands of digital warriors, massive practical sets, and weeks of shooting. Weta Digital developed new crowd simulation software to render armies that felt organic and chaotic.
When you're shooting 3 movies back to back and they're all out of order, you really, it's impossible to actually judge the length. You don't know whether you're making 2-hour films or 3-hour films or 4-hour films. I mean, there's no way of accurately kind of predicting.
Jackson pushed everyone to the limit, often working through the night to meet the release deadline. At the box office, Return of the King went on to earn over $1 billion worldwide, a staggering financial success. It became the highest-grossing film of that year, and also the second highest-grossing film of all time at that point, just behind Titanic. This solidified the trilogy as one of the most successful investments in cinema history, with home videos, extended editions, generating long-term revenue for New Line Cinema. But way more importantly, through back-end deals and his deep involvement across the production, Jackson wasn't just earning as a director, he was profiting across multiple layers of the production pipeline. He earned another $10 million director's fee, and his profit split on the worldwide box office gross was an estimated $85 million from the film's theatrical revenue alone. His controlling stake in Weta had quietly become $1 billion asset. To top things off in the most explosive way possible, The Return of the King reached a rare gold status on Oscar night. It swept the Academy Awards, winning all 11 categories for which it was nominated. The film took home the award for Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Original Score, Best Original Song, Best Sound Mixing, Best Picture, Best Visual Effects, Best Art Direction, Best Costume Design, Best Makeup, Best Film Editing, and lastly, Best Director for Peter Jackson. It was the perfect ending to a cinematic event that had redefined fantasy, blockbuster storytelling, and independent filmmaking on a global scale. The Oscar for Best Director was just an industry capstone, but the real reward was the freedom to do anything he wanted, and what he wanted next was a return to an idea that came as a childhood obsession.
Look, chocolate. You like chocolate?
King Kong tells the story of Carl Denham, an ambitious filmmaker who drags his cast and crew to the mysterious Skull Island, where they encounter a legendary ape who becomes fixated on Anne Darrow, a struggling actress in New York who joins Carl's expedition. Eventually, Kong is captured and brought to New York, where he escapes, rampages through the city, and climbs the Empire State Building before randomly being shot down by fighter planes. It's a tragedy wrapped in spectacle, a monster movie that begs for sympathy for the monster. Jackson had been obsessed with the original since he was a child, even attempting to remake it years earlier before The Lord of the Rings. Now, with his reputation solidified and trust from the industry at an all-time high, he finally had the opportunity to bring that vision to life on the biggest scale possible.
I tried to do it in 1996. I spent 7 or 8 months on it then, and the studio pulled the plug on it when Godzilla and Mighty Joe Young were coming out. And luckily we had Lord of the Rings in development at the same time, so we jumped onto that, got that done, and then, I was luckily in that position at the end of Lord of the Rings, that wonderful position where I could do anything I wanted to do.
Backed by Universal Pictures, the film was given a massive budget of around $207 million, making it one of the most expensive films ever made at the time. But unlike many directors who reach this level and play it safe, Jackson went all in on ambition. He threw himself into the production with the same obsessive detail that had defined Middle-earth. He co-wrote the script with his wife, and Philippa Boyens. Production was based entirely in New Zealand, using the now world-class facilities of the Winter Workshop. When the film hit the theaters, it grossed over $550 million worldwide, a respectable return, but with a $200 million budget and hundreds of millions spent on marketing, King Kong barely broke even in theaters, earning a modest $50 to $60 million in profit. However, home videos changed the financial game for the film, selling over $350 million in North America alone, pushing firmly into profitability. Jackson earned an upfront directing fee of $20 million and 20% of gross profits, cementing his status among the richest directors in cinema. The movie currently holds an 84% critic score, with praise for its performances and faithfulness to the original. A few people thought the 3-hour runtime was too excessive, criticizing the unnecessary romantic subplot and tone. Regardless though, the movie won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Visual Effects, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Sound Editing. While this film proved once again that Jackson could handle massive spectacle and cutting-edge effects, it was also a reminder that even the most ambitious projects carried financial risk. After conquering both epic fantasy with The Lord of the Rings and King Kong, Jackson shifted gears, tackling something far more intimate and emotionally complex.
I'm not gonna hurt you, Susie.
Based on Alice Sebold's best-selling novel, The Lovely Bones follows Susie Salmon, a teenage girl brutally murdered by her neighbor, who narrates the film from her own version of the afterlife, a shimmering, surreal world that reflects her grief, anger, and longing. While watching her family cope with her loss on Earth, Susie also observes her killer, struggling with the tension between seeking justice and letting go. The novel had been a literary phenomenon that spent weeks at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. Propelled by its shocking premise, Jackson was drawn to its emotional core and bought the rights to it in 2005 and began developing the script with his co-writers. The budget was set for $65 million. Witter Digital created sweeping dreamlike landscapes, from fields of golden grass to a surreal, ever-changing shoreline. Ryan Gosling was originally cast as Susie's father, but Gosling had gained some weight and grown a beard for the role without discussing the changes with Jackson, so he replaced him with Mark Wahlberg. Unlike his previous blockbusters, this was a psychological and emotional drama, testing Jackson's ability to handle subtle performances and tone without relying on spectacle or action. At the box office, The Lovely Bones grossed over $93 million, not enough to break even, and a huge commercial setback. By the time all costs were accounted for, The Lovely Bones likely lost $20 to $30 million for the studio. The material was dark, and the PG-13 rating confused viewers who expected either a hard-hitting drama or a family fantasy. Also, the December release date, while intended for award season, put it against heavy hitters like Avatar, which dominated the box office for months. For Jackson, the financial disappointment was compounded by the critical reception and the difficulty of balancing dark subject matter with whimsical fantasy. On the bright side, the film found a second life on streaming years later, reaching number 5 on Netflix's global top 10 and racking up millions of views. After this detour, Jackson returned to the world that made him legendary. But this time, he went back to the book that started it all. Set 60 years before The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson was back in his full element, crafting another fantasy world, but this time, He had almost no time to prepare. Guillermo del Toro had spent 2 years developing the project before leaving, and Jackson had to step in at the last minute with cameras ready to roll. As usual, filming took place in New Zealand, on a budget of $180 million. The studio wanted 2 films, but Jackson argued for a trilogy, claiming there was enough material from Tolkien's novel and Middle-earth's extensive lore to justify 3 movies. The story follows Bilbo Baggins, a random hobbit from the Shire who is reluctantly recruited by the wizard Gandalf and a company of 13 dwarves, with the goal of reclaiming the Lonely Mountain and its treasure from the scary talking dragon. Technologically, Jackson pushed boundaries by shooting in 48 frames per second and using extensive digital effects to de-age characters and bring Smaug to life, while Weta Digital handled motion capture, digital doubles, and massive crowd simulations for battle sequences.
I do think it's time as an industry that we have to look at how we can use today's technology to make the cinema experience bigger and better and more immersive, more spectacular.
The Hobbit went on to gross over $1 billion at the global box office, making it one of the highest-grossing films in an extremely stacked year. Television licensing, home videos, and streaming deals earned the movie over $100 million more in revenue. By any financial metric, this film was a massive global success. Jackson's personal payday was equally impressive. He earned $20 million upfront to direct. He negotiated a 20% profit participation, a back-end deal that gave him 1/5 of the film's net profits. With the movie generating over $200 million in profit for the studio, Jackson's back-end cut alone was a reported $50 million. Combined with his upfront fee and producer credits, his total take from the first Hobbit approached $70 million. And, as always, Weta also profited from the movie's success. The visual effects work on this film was extensive, employing over 1,000 people at its peak. Jackson's controlling stake in the company meant every dollar spent on effects was also an investment in their own asset, adding long-term value to Weta, which would later be sold for over $1 billion. Even though a few people complained about the overextension of the story, the film retained enough charm and spectacle to appeal strongly to Tolkien fans. With the foundation set, Jackson pushed forward, raising the stakes and moving closer to the final confrontation. The sequel picks up with Bilbo and the dwarves continuing their journey toward the Lonely Mountain. Along the way, they face all sorts of creatures and growing internal tension within the group. But the subtle focus is on Bilbo's transformation as he becomes more confident, more cunning, and more influenced by the power of the ring. The journey ultimately leads to the confrontation with Smaug, the dragon guarding the mountain's treasure. Following the success of the first film, Jackson doubled down on scale and spectacle. The production was even more grueling, set in New Zealand, with Jackson still writing scenes the night before shooting. With a budget of $200 million, Jackson leaned into large-scale action sequences, blending practical effects with cutting-edge visual effects. Unlike the first film, which had the advantage of introducing Middle-earth, the sequel had to raise stakes while managing a sprawling cast and increasingly complex action. Unlike The Lord of the Rings, where Jackson adapted 3 books equally, this film attempted to adapt a single book into a trilogy, which was a gamble for the audience palate.
The great thing with a middle movie in a trilogy is its primary role is to deepen, increase the conflict, increase the difficulty for our characters, which is actually, in a movie terms, it's a lot of fun. That means there's a lot of things that happen that you put in the way of the characters, obstacles they have to overcome.
At the box office, the film grossed over $950 million worldwide, slightly less than its predecessor but still a massive commercial success, landing among the top 5 highest-grossing films of the year. Like the first film, profitability extended well beyond theaters, with strong home video sales, merchandising, and licensing deals ensuring long-term revenue. As always, Jackson and Weta also took their cut from the back end, with his profit participation adding tens of millions more to his personal earnings. With a critic score of 74% and an audience score of 85%, the sequel delivered exactly what audiences expected: bigger action, more spectacle, and a deeper dive into Middle-earth. But the journey wasn't over. Peace was never going to last, and this time, it would lead to an all-out war. The Battle of the Five Armies continues after Smaug's attack, as Thorin reclaims the Lonely Mountain but is consumed by greed. As men, elves, and dwarves gather for the treasure, tensions erupt into a massive war. Caught in the middle, Bilbo must choose between loyalty and doing what's right, as the story builds toward Thorin's downfall and redemption. With a production budget of $250 million, this was the most expensive undertaking of Jackson's career. He leaned heavily into spectacle, building the movie around extended battle sequences that pushed Weta Digital's capabilities even further. By the time production began on the third film, Peter Jackson was running on fumes. He had been living and breathing Middle-earth for nearly 3 consecutive years, having shot the trilogy back-to-back. Now he was on another back-to-back schedule, and the timing and production was brutal. The shift toward action over narrative was noticeable, as the story had already been stretched across 3 films. At the box office, the trilogy grossed over $960 million worldwide, making it another major commercial success. But by this point, the financial trend was clear. While still hugely profitable, the returns had plateaued compared to the first film. Regardless though, it was extremely successful and put a cap to Jackson's fantasy world. After the Battle of the Five Armies, Peter Jackson stepped away from directing for 4 years. His next projects would be documentaries, which were more personal and completely free of studio oversight. With his filmography earning a combined 20 Academy Awards and grossing over $6 billion at the box office, Peter Jackson proved that no matter how many times you fall short, whether it's a scrappy splatter film or a passion project that misses commercially, success is always just around the corner.
Up to Heavenly Creatures, I'd done some horror movies and things, and we'd always done our own effects. I mean, we'd done all of our special effects, which were all prosthetics and prosthetic effects and zombie stuff and all that. But we had done it ourselves, and I love it. I love effects. I'd never want to give them to somebody else to do because they're part of the fun of filmmaking.
Well, that's it for today. Please don't forget to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you so much for watching.
Position